Okay, let's talk about fonts. One of the things that can really make a website more distinctive is to choose fonts that work well together. CSS lets you change all sorts of things about the font in which your text gets displayed. Now, fonts are actually really complicated, and there's a whole history of typography that we are totally not getting into in this course. We'll just touch the basics that every CSS user will need. If you're used to working with fonts in a word processor, what you think of as a font, CSS actually calls a font family. This is the name of a typeface, like Times New Roman, or Helvetica, or Impact. Applying a font-family rule to an element will make text in that element show up in that font. Well, it'll try to anyway. Not every computer or device has the same fonts installed. If you ask for a font family and the user's device doesn't have it, CSS just won't do anything. It'll just leave the text in the default font family, which is usually something boring but inoffensive, like Times. If you don't care exactly what font family the user sees, but you know that you want it to be a particular sort of font, CSS offers generic font families for these. There are 5 of these, and they're named for 5 general categories of fonts: serif, sans serif, cursive, fantasy, and monospace. You can say font-family : monospace, and be sure that you're getting some monospace font when you don't care whether it turns out to be Courier New or Inconsolata. But usually we use generic fonts as a fallback plan in case the browser doesn't have access to a particular font that we do want. Because of that, CSS lets us write a font stack, a list of font families, usually ending with the generic. So for instance, Windows has this really nice font called Constantia, but it's only available on Windows. We might say, okay, there are other similar fonts on other platforms, like Georgia, and then if we don't have that, we'll settle for any serif font. There are other things we can control about the font besides the typeface, though. There's the font size, which is how big the text is. Usually we measure this in points, but CSS lets you use whatever unit you want. You can say, I want a font size of 1 inch, which is the same as 72 points. Other things you might want to control about the font, like bold or italic or underline, actually work kind of differently in CSS than they do in a word processor. Like in Google Docs, bold and italic and underline are all just buttons right next to each other. But in CSS, these are all controlled by different properties. Bold is font-weight : bold, and italic is font-style : italic. And underline is actually text-decoration : underline. Fortunately, you don't ever need to actually use those. You can specify everything about the font you want in a single line. There's a property called font that lets you combine all of these properties into a single line. So instead of writing all of these different properties, you can just write this. Unfortunately, you do have to write those parts in a specific order, which I always have to look up. So I'm just going to suggest you look it up too.